This collection of 10 eerie stories takes you into the heart of fear, where ordinary events turn into chilling encounters. Each tale unravels a unique mystery, drawing readers into a world where the line between reality and terror blurs. From unsettling strangers to dark secrets, these stories explore moments of suspense that will leave you questioning what's lurking in the shadows. Prepare for a gripping journey through 10 unforgettable, spine-tingling experiences. The story number 1. Unexpected Visitor. It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah settled into her cozy living room, enjoying the crackling warmth of the fireplace. Her kids were already asleep upstairs, and her husband was out of town for work. She loved these rare, quiet moments, the house wrapped in a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Just as Sarah was about to pour herself a glass of wine, there was a knock at the door. It was strange. Nobody ever visited this late. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. Maybe it was a neighbor in need of something? Curiosity getting the better of her, Sarah walked to the front door and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood there, shivering in the cold, her face partially hidden under a hood. Sarah's heart sank. The woman looked vaguely familiar, like someone she'd met once at a friend's gathering years ago. Without thinking too much, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked cautiously. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes darting around nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a friend of your mom's. She asked me to drop something off." Sarah's stomach tightened. Her mom lived out of state and rarely sent anything. Still, the woman looked harmless enough, her small frame bundled in layers of clothing. Sarah reluctantly opened the door wider. Before Sarah could react, the woman pushed her way inside, slamming the door behind her. Sarah's heart raced as the woman stepped forward, her smile twisted into something menacing. "I didn't come here to drop something off," she whispered, her voice low and chilling. Panicking, Sarah backed away, her eyes searching for anything to defend herself. The woman's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She took another step forward, and that's when Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, her neighbor Mark coming to check on her. The unexpected visitor froze, hearing the footsteps too. Before she could act, Mark's knock interrupted the eerie tension. With a look of frustration, the woman bolted for the back door and vanished into the night. Mark's timely arrival saved Sarah from what could have been a much darker fate. But the identity and motives of the woman remained a mystery, haunting Sarah for years to come. Story number 2. Grandmother's Cold Revenge. It was a bitterly cold winter evening when Margaret, an 80-year-old grandmother, began her usual walk home from the town's community center. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she shuffled down the dimly lit sidewalk, her breath visible in the freezing air. Despite her age, Margaret was sharp and vigilant. A widow of many years, she prided herself on her independence. But that night, something was different. As she rounded the corner near her house, she felt it. Someone was behind her. Margaret's heart raced, though she kept her pace steady, refusing to show any sign of fear. The footsteps quickened, growing louder with each step. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw a shadowy figure moving toward her. Her hand tightened around the strap of her purse. But more importantly, it found the familiar grip of the small .38 revolver tucked away in her coat pocket. A gift from her late husband, who had always insisted on her being able to protect herself. The stranger's voice rang out behind her, rough and menacing. "Give me your purse, lady." Margaret didn't hesitate. She turned sharply to face the man, his features obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was younger, stronger, but he underestimated her. "I don't think so," she said, her voice cold and steady. Before he could react, she raised the gun and fired. The blast echoed down the empty street. The man stumbled back, clutching his arm as blood seeped through his jacket. He fell to the ground, groaning in pain. Margaret didn't move for a moment, watching as the reality of what she had done settled in. But she didn't feel guilty. She felt justified. This man had chosen her as his victim, but he had no idea that this grandmother wasn't an easy target. The police arrived shortly after, and the man was taken into custody. He survived the gunshot wound and was later sentenced to prison for attempted robbery. For the rest of her life, Margaret never regretted what she did that night. "I didn't seek revenge," she would say, "but if you come for me, you'd better be ready to face the consequences." Story number 3. The mysterious dark shiny black SUV was a quiet Friday night when Emma, a 19-year-old college student, was babysitting for the Johnson family in their peaceful suburban neighborhood. The kids were fast asleep upstairs, and Emma settled into the living room couch, scrolling through her phone. She glanced at the clock, 10:45 at night. The parents weren't due back for another hour. Suddenly the house phone rang, startling her. No one ever called the landline. Hesitant, she picked up. "Hello?" she said, her voice soft. No one answered, just the sound of shallow breathing on the other end. She quickly hung up, dismissing it as a prank call. But something about the silence that followed felt eerie, unsettling. She peeked through the curtains and noticed it for the first time. A dark, shiny black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, headlights off. At first, she thought nothing of it. People sometimes pulled over to take a phone call or check their GPS. But as the minutes ticked by, the car didn't move. A strange unease settled in the pit of her stomach. Why was it just sitting there watching? Emma tried to shake off the growing paranoia. She turned back to her phone, but now her thoughts were racing. The quiet street, the dark night, the parked SUV. She glanced outside again, this time noticing a figure in the driver's seat, barely visible in the dim light. Her heart began to pound. She texted Mrs. Johnson. "Is anyone expected to come by tonight? There's a car parked outside." No response. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights flicked on. Emma froze as the vehicle slowly pulled forward, crawling up the street. But just as it passed the house, it made a sharp U-turn and parked again. Closer this time. Emma's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and called 911. "There's a suspicious car outside and I'm babysitting 2 kids," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It keeps moving up and down the street." Within minutes, police cars pulled up, but by then, the dark, shiny black SUV was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The officers took her statement, reassuring her it was probably nothing. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something. A warning, a threat, something far more sinister. For weeks, she couldn't forget the glowing headlights and the lingering presence of the mysterious, dark, shiny black SUV. Story number 4. The Man in the Bedroom. It was a stormy night when 7-year-old Lily woke up to the sound of thunder rumbling through the house. Lightning flashed outside, casting eerie shadows on her bedroom walls. She turned over in bed, clutching her stuffed bear tighter, hoping the storm would soon pass. But something else was bothering her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Lily's room felt unusually cold, and she sensed she wasn't alone. Her heart raced as her eyes darted to the corner of the room. That's when she saw him. A man stood by the window, his back turned, his figure barely illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamp outside. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hat that cast a long shadow over his face. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice. She slid under the covers, trembling, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But when she peeked out again, the man hadn't moved. He was still there, standing silently, as if watching something, or waiting. Terrified, Lily slipped out of bed and ran to her mother's room. She shook her awake, her voice a desperate whisper. "Mommy, there's a man in my room." At first, her mother thought it was just a nightmare. She stroked Lily's hair and reassured her. But when she saw the terror in her daughter's eyes, she knew something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down the hallway, with Lily close behind. They entered the room cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. To her relief, the man was gone. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something terrifying. Lily's window was open, rain blowing in, curtains flapping in the wind. Her heart sank. She had locked that window before bed. They checked the house, every door and window, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No sign of the man Lily had seen. That night they stayed in the same bed, doors locked, hearts pounding. A few weeks later they heard the news. A man had been arrested 2 streets away for breaking into homes, watching families as they slept. Lily's mother never told her, but she knew in her gut who had been standing in her daughter's room that night. Story number 5. The Witch's Cackle. It was an ordinary evening when Jenna and her husband, Mark, moved into their new house. The house last box finally unpacked, Mark suggested they celebrate with a bottle of wine. As Jenna poured the glasses, Mark ventured into the basement to store some old tools. The basement was unfinished, cold, and slightly damp. Nothing too unusual for a house this old. As Mark flicked on the light, the bulb flickered before plunging him into total darkness. Annoyed, he fumbled for his phone to use its flashlight. But in the unsettling silence, something else caught his attention. A sound, faint but distinct, rose from the far corner of the basement. It was a laugh, a low, raspy cackle, like something straight out of a horror movie. Mark froze, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The sound grew louder, echoing through the cold basement air. It was unmistakable, a witch-like cackle. Mark's heart raced as his flashlight finally flicked on. He spun the light toward the noise, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The basement was empty. Only the old boiler stood in the corner, creaking like it always did. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. "Jenna, did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Hear what?" she replied, holding out a glass of wine, oblivious to his fear. The laugh, that creepy, witchy laugh, it was coming from the basement. Jenna raised an eyebrow, amused. "The house is old, Mark. It's probably just the pipes." Mark wasn't convinced. He had heard something down there. Days passed, but the thought of the cackle haunted him. Determined to find an explanation, he called a plumber to check for strange noises. The plumber found nothing unusual, but just as he was about to leave, the light in the basement went out again. And then, the laugh returned. This time, the plumber heard it too, clear as day. Yeah, the plumber stammered, backing away. "I think you've got more than just old pipes down there." The cackle was never explained, and from that night forward, neither Mark nor Jenna ever set foot in the basement again. Story number 6. The hidden stranger Alex, a college student juggling part-time work and classes, was struggling with calculus. He hired a tutor, Rebecca, who came highly recommended by his friends. She lived alone in a small apartment not far from campus. Every Tuesday night, Alex would go to her place for their tutoring sessions. One cold evening, things felt a bit off as soon as he walked into her apartment. Rebecca was friendly as always, but Alex couldn't shake the strange feeling creeping over him. The apartment felt darker, colder, and for some reason he kept hearing faint creaking sounds as if someone was shifting their weight in the room. As they sat on the floor reviewing equations, Alex noticed something odd. The blanket draped over Rebecca's bed seemed to move slightly. At first he brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the breeze from the open window. But then, it happened again, this time more pronounced, as if someone was under there. Heart pounding, Alex tried to focus on the lesson, but curiosity got the better of him. "Rebecca, do you have a pet or something?" he asked, glancing nervously at the bed. She looked confused. "No, why?" Alex pointed to the bed. "I think something's moving under there." Rebecca's face went pale. Without a word, she stood up and cautiously approached the bed. She knelt down, grabbing the edge of the blanket with trembling fingers, and pulled it up in one swift motion. Both of them froze in horror. A man, disheveled and gaunt, was lying underneath the bed, staring right back at them. His eyes were wild, and he immediately tried to scramble out, but Alex grabbed a chair and blocked his way. Rebecca screamed, running to call the police as Alex kept his eyes on the intruder. When the police arrived and took the man away, they found out that he was a homeless man who had been sneaking into the building for months. He had somehow found his way into Rebecca's apartment and had been secretly living under her bed for nearly 2 weeks. He would leave when she went to work and return when she wasn't looking. Rebecca, shaken, moved out the next day. And Alex never forgot the haunting realization that sometimes you're not as alone as you think. Story number 7. The ambush in Amboy. Jake Simmons was a Marine who had seen his fair share of action. After serving multiple tours overseas, he had learned to trust his instincts. It was a quiet Sunday evening when he was driving down a deserted highway in Amboy, a small ghost town in the middle of the Mojave Desert. He was heading back to base after visiting family when something strange caught his attention. Up ahead, he saw an old pickup truck stopped in the middle of the road. The hood was up, and a man was waving for help. Jake's military training kicked in immediately. Something wasn't right. There was no traffic on this stretch of road, and the nearest town was miles away. The scene felt staged. Slowing down as he approached the truck, Jake noticed something even more unsettling. There were fresh tire tracks leading off into the desert, barely visible in the fading light. He kept his distance and observed the man from inside his vehicle. The man continued waving, but Jake could see no urgency in his movements. His clothes were clean, too clean for someone supposedly stranded in the desert. Jake's heart began to race. He scanned the area and spotted a second figure hiding behind a cluster of rocks off to the side of the road. That was all the confirmation he needed. This was an ambush, and he wasn't going to fall for it. Instead of stopping, Jake revved his engine and veered off the road, driving around the truck and keeping his foot on the gas. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man who had been hiding jump out, clearly frustrated that his plan had failed. Jake drove for miles without looking back. When he finally got to the next town, he stopped at a diner and reported the incident to local authorities. Later that week, he learned that another driver hadn't been so lucky. A car had been found abandoned on the same stretch of road, and the driver was still missing. To this day, Jake thanks his training and his instincts for saving his life that night in Amboy. What could have ended in tragedy became a chilling reminder. Not all dangers come from battlefields. Sometimes they hide in plain sight on quiet, deserted roads. Story number 8. The Screams by the River. It was supposed to be just another peaceful night of fishing by the river. A group of old friends had gathered by the banks of the secluded Hollow Creek, a spot they'd been visiting since their teenage years. The sun had long set, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the water as their lines bobbed quietly in the current. The night was calm, save for the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. They sat around, sharing stories and laughter, reminiscing about their younger days. But as the evening wore on, an odd sense of unease began to settle over them. Around midnight, a piercing scream broke the stillness of the night. It wasn't an animal sound. They'd all heard the usual wildlife in the area over the years, but this was different. It was human. The scream echoed along the river, sending a chill through each of them. For a moment, they sat frozen, unsure if what they had just heard was real. Then it came again, louder this time, more desperate. A woman's voice, unmistakable now. She sounded terrified, and it seemed to be coming from the dense woods across the river. "Should we check it out?" one of them asked, though none of them wanted to move. "Maybe it's just someone playing a prank," another suggested, trying to dismiss the tension in the air. But then, the scream came again, followed by an unsettling silence. It was too real, too panicked to ignore. Grabbing their flashlights, the group cautiously made their way along the riverbank, the sound of their footsteps crunching against the gravel, mixing with the low rustle of the wind through the trees. When they reached the spot where the scream had seemed to come from, they found nothing. No signs of a person, no footprints, no movement. The forest was completely still. Just as they began to turn back, another scream rang out, this time impossibly from the other side of the river where they had been just moments ago. Fear gripped them as they realized there was no one to be found. The source of the screams remained a mystery. But that night, the friends packed up and left the river, never to return. To this day, no one knows who or what was crying out for help by Hollow Creek. Story number 9. The silent phone call. It was late in the evening when Emma realized her phone was missing. She had just come home from a night out with friends, and as she rummaged through her bag, panic set in. Her phone was gone. After checking her car, retracing her steps, and even calling the restaurant, she accepted that it must have slipped out somewhere along the way. Annoyed but calm, she borrowed her roommate's phone to call her own, hoping someone might pick it up. After a few rings, to her surprise, the call connected. "Hello?" Emma said, expecting to hear a good Samaritan on the other end, but it was silence there. "Hello? Can you hear me?" she asked, but still, no response. There was no noise, no background chatter, just an unsettling, heavy silence. Emma repeated herself, growing frustrated. "If you found my phone, please let me know. I just want it back." Still, there was no reply. She could hear faint breathing, but no one spoke. Feeling uneasy, she hung up and dialed again. This time, the call was answered immediately, but the silence was even more unnerving. The faint breathing was still there, but now it seemed deliberate, as if someone was trying to let her know they were listening closely, refusing to speak. Emma's pulse quickened, her hands shaking slightly. "Who is this? Please, if you found my phone, just say something." The call remained mute, and suddenly, the line went dead. Heart racing, she stared at the borrowed phone in disbelief. Her first thought was that it must be a prank. Maybe someone found her phone and thought it would be funny to mess with her, but something felt off. She couldn't shake the eerie feeling that whoever was on the other end wasn't playing a prank. There was an unsettling deliberateness to the silence. Deciding to report it to the authorities, she grabbed her things and got ready to leave. Just as she reached the front door, her landline phone began ringing. Startled, Emma froze. No one ever called her landline. It rang again, loud and insistent. She picked up the receiver and whispered, "Hello?" Once again, only silence greeted her, but this time it felt closer. Story number 10. The Neighbor's Dark Obsession. Sophie was a lively 6-year-old, full of energy and innocence, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her parents. They had just moved in a few months earlier, and everything seemed perfect. Their neighbors were friendly, the area was safe, and Sophie loved her new room, especially the spacious closet where she would often play with her dolls. But recently, Sophie started telling her parents strange things. "Mommy, the man in my closet watched me sleep again last night," she would say innocently. Her mother, assuming it was just a bad dream or Sophie's imagination running wild, would reassure her. "There's no one in your closet, sweetie. It's just a shadow." One night, Sophie's parents were having dinner when they heard a faint creaking noise from her room. Curious, her dad went upstairs to check on her. He found Sophie fast asleep, but something caught his attention. The closet door was slightly ajar. He was sure they always closed it before bed. Dismissing it, he gently closed the door again and kissed Sophie on the forehead before heading back downstairs. The following night, Sophie's mother tucked her in. As she turned off the lights, Sophie whispered, "Mommy, he's watching again." Chills ran down her spine, but she laughed it off. "You're safe here, baby. No one is watching you." But her daughter's words lingered in her mind. The real horror came a week later. Sophie's mother was cleaning her room while she was at school. As she was dusting the closet door, she noticed something odd. There were faint scratches on the inside of the closet door frame, as if someone had been pressing against it from the inside. Her heart pounded. But she told herself it must be old damage from a previous tenant. That night, Sophie refused to sleep in her room. "He's in there again," she whispered, terrified. This time, her father took her seriously. He opened the closet slowly, expecting to find nothing, just to prove there was no man. But there was something. A figure crouched in the corner. It was their neighbor, pale and wide-eyed, staring at them in eerie silence. He had been living inside their house, sneaking into Sophie's room at night, watching her sleep. The police arrived quickly, but the damage was done. The thought that someone had been hiding in their home for so long, feeding off their daughter's innocence, haunted them forever. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment down below, and share for more stories.